Thank you. We want to welcome everyone to the, by my count, 15th virtual meeting of the Philadelphia Police Advisory Commission. I'm Rhonda Goldfein. We'll do a little bit of a roll call and then get into the agenda that Danny, the champion multitasker, has put into the chat. Sean along.
Sean's here.
Wonderful. Mujib Chaudhry.
I saw Mujib, he's here.
Ben Geffen, I see. Hi, Ben. Our parliamentarian, George Mosey, I see. Bilal Qayyum. I don't see Bilal, but I'm looking at a smaller screen.
You don't see Bilal yet?
Okay. Let's see, where were we? Michael Ramming.
No, Michael.
I see Michael Wehrman. And Sarah Young.
Do not see Sarah yet.
Okay, so we're hoping that our other folks will join us. Anthony, we'll pass to you to introduce yourself and the staff, please.
All right, my name is Anthony Arachi. I'm the Interim Executive Director of the Police Advisory Commission. With us tonight is the MC, Danny, who makes sure everything runs smoothly. We also have Janine Zajac, give a wave there. Angelica Hendricks, both our policy analysts. We have Talia Grimmage. Pop your head in there, Talia. And give a wave if you can. And if not, that's okay too. There you go. Okay. Not with us, but with us in spirit is Anastasia McCarthy, who's also a policy analyst. So tonight, I can just, oh wait, so you have some stuff to do, Rhonda, before I get into my, yeah, go ahead, take it away. Sorry about that.
That's okay, that's okay. So do we have a motion to approve the minutes from our May meeting? So it looks like we had, Ben was motioning, Sean was second. Do we have a vote in favor? George, I know I never do this exactly the same way. Okay, any opposition? Any abstentions? Looks like the motion passed. Thanks very much. And Anthony, at the risk of kind of stepping on your toes of what you were planning to talk about, I'll start and then you can take over if that's okay.
Step away, step away.
So, we are happy to be reporting that since we last met, the City Council has voted to approve the Civilian Police Oversight Commission. Yay. And according to, I think it was Friday's Inquirer, there's a little bit more than $2 million budget assigned to the commission. Is that right, Anthony?
Yeah, so far.
So I think that, or I know that there is still work to be done in terms of the transition of the Philadelphia Police Advisory Commission to CPOC. There's many roles to be filled, and I have to be honest, I'm not sure where our role is and whether the Police Advisory Commission expires on July 1 or we maintain ourselves until there's an executive order or rescission of the executive order. So there are still some details to be worked out, but the good news is we are moving forward. And I think that I want to thank all of you who have supported this effort moving forward. You know, we all recognize that civilian oversight is crucial for Philadelphia. We are solidly on the path for Philadelphia to have this oversight that it needs. And so I think that's all exciting stuff. Anthony, I know that you have more detail on this, so how about I pass to you for any other updates?
Well, regarding the transition and CPOC, there's I think you pretty much covered as much as we know right now. I mean, I think that it's a huge deal that this was signed into law by the mayor, and I am really, really excited and proud of the city of Philadelphia for taking these steps. I think that we're going to make Philadelphia help make Philadelphia a better place, and I think it's going to be great. Other updates in general, for the month of May, we had 9 complaints against police that were forwarded to Internal Affairs, and that brings us to 42 for the year, which is actually less than normal. So hopefully, things go well and cases don't explode for the summer. The second update that we have is we have a website for our mediation program, which is a very exciting thing. Danny's going to put it in the chat if it's not there already. And you should all check it out. It gives you an explanation of the program, how it works, and we're about ready to start flying with it. So, it's very exciting. It's going to be a way to bring low-level complaints in the community and the police department together, hopefully to create greater understanding, each understanding where the other one's coming from, and hopefully resolve these issues outside of an internal affairs investigation. So give the website a look. It's really great, and I think you guys, it's something I think everyone can buy into. Aside from that, we have one other small update before we get to our main presentation, and that is that our office will be opening to the public on July 6th. So aside from, we will be sort of returning to more complete service at that point. During the COVID closings, we all made a lot of on-the-fly changes to make sure that we did not have any lapse in service for the public whenever they needed us. But now you'll have a few more avenues to connect with us and CPOC when if you need to or want to. So we'll be available in the office, and we'll also be mobile once again. So we used to do is if there was a complainant or something or a constituent that wanted to talk to us or interact with us in some way and couldn't travel, we would go out to them, and we'll be able to continue to do that going forward starting on July 6th. If you do decide to come down and see us at the office, please wear a mask. Everyone's going to need one to come in to see us, and if you don't have one, we'll make sure we get you one. So come see us and say hi, and hope to see everybody again soon. Coming up, we have a presentation, Collaborative Review and Reform of the Philadelphia Police Department Police Board of Inquiry. This is, I love this report. I love this project, and I think it's a great model, and hopefully a model for the future of oversight and the police department collaborating together to solve problems. This was a long-term project with the Philadelphia Police Department and the Police Advisory Commission. It was a lot of work, and it took a lot of dedication, and I think it came out fantastic. And I think when you see the recommendations and everything, all the work that went into it and everything that the police department's doing to respond to those recommendations, I think everyone's going to love it. We're going to post a link to it if anyone hasn't read it, and we're going to see a great presentation by our policy analysts, Angelica Hendricks, Janine Zajac, and a special guest from the Philadelphia Police Department, Deputy Commissioner Nash, who we are proud to have with us tonight. So with that, take it away.
I just put the link to the report if you did not get that. And I'm going to start the presentation. Just give me 1 second. There we go. Sorry about that delay. All right, I'll turn it over to Angelica and Janine. Sorry, let me just back up. there we go. Sorry about that. Hope Angelica's muted. Sorry.
Great, thanks, Danny. It didn't let me talk for some reason. Thanks for the introduction. So tonight, we're going to talk about our latest project, which is on the PBI process, which is the Police Board of Inquiry, which took a very long time, but there are going to be a few speakers on the same report, so please bear with us as we're trying to navigate technology. So I'll turn it over to Janine.
All right, Danny, do you want to go to the next slide, please?
Of course.
Great. So I'll just do just a quick introduction. I'll try to speak generally about the discipline process. It's a very detailed process within the police department, so it's hard to cover all of the details in this presentation. There's a ton of information in our report. So if you want to know more, obviously check the report out. There's a ton of information in there. We'll try to keep it relatively short just so we can have time for questions and comments at the end of the presentation. So the discipline charging and hearing process at the police department presented numerous opportunities to increase accountability, efficiency, and procedural justice. That's sort of the general theme of this project and of the report. We wanted to release it this summer when we did for a number of reasons. As we talked about already, the Citizens Police Oversight Commission was being discussed in City Council, the legislation was coming out, and that was very much tied into the discipline process at the police department. The role that CPOC is going to play in the discipline process moving forward is still going to be worked out, but this is all very much related. We wanted to make sure that this really relevant project was being released right now so that it could all sort of come together. And we all know the FOP contract is also being renegotiated this summer. And anything that has to do with discipline is always going to need to be covered in the police contract. So we wanted to make sure that all of these reforms, all of these ideas for how to improve the discipline process were at the front of the mind of everyone involved in this contract negotiation process. Danny, you can move to the next slide, actually. I think this is a good place. So before we get into all of the recommendations and the reforms that we are going to move forward with, I wanted to make sure we go through sort of a flow chart here of the actual discipline process and show the life of a misconduct allegation against the police department, just so that we have a general understanding of how everything works and what parts of the process we are trying to touch with this project. So when someone files a complaint against the police department, it's investigated by Internal Affairs, or known as IAD. So if the investigation finds that an officer committed misconduct, the case then moves forward to the charging unit at the police department. And that's sort of highlighted in yellow there on the at the top of the flow chart there. So that charging unit is led by a captain who's assisted by a couple of support staff. And the captain of the charging unit, once he receives the sustained misconduct from Internal Affairs, reviews the cases and decides which charges from the PPD disciplinary code to apply. So that decision made at the charging unit then determines the severity of punishment that an officer can eventually receive. So, and also the charging unit can then, the captain of the charging unit can help decide to divert an officer to a non-disciplinary outcome called training and counseling. And that's sort of that offshoot there on the flow chart. So the charging unit, you can see it's at the top of the flow chart. It's very important because everything flows through it. All sustained misconduct flows through the charging unit. And even though it is this very key part of the discipline process, it really functions behind the scenes at the police department. So because it's this sort of crucial decision point, this is why we wanted to focus on the charging unit in this report. Basically, if any mistakes get made, if there's any oversights at this level at the charging unit, then the rest of the discipline process that comes after it on the flow chart, the integrity of that can kind of be chipped away at or maybe threatened. So that's why the charging unit is so heavily featured in this first report. And once an officer receives discipline charges from the charging unit, sort of flowing down the flow chart there, the officer can plead guilty or not guilty. And if they plead not guilty to their charge, the case then goes forward to the department advocate. So that's a very important position within the discipline process, because that position, the department advocate, can negotiate plea deals for discipline charges and then also serves as a prosecutor during discipline hearings. And that's the PBI hearings. It stands for Police Board of Inquiry. We commonly refer to it as a PBI hearing. So if the officer maintains a not guilty plea and the case goes forward to that PBI hearing, the officer has an FOP attorney who represents them at that hearing, and a PBI board that's made of 3 officers of varying ranks who act as the judge in that case. So it's very similar to a trial, but it's just a less formal process. So a key point that made us want to undertake some reforms and reviews of these PBI hearings is that everyone who's involved in those hearings right now are either employees of the police department or representing the officer as an attorney at that hearing. And there'll be a lot more information about our recommendations and the PBI hearing process as we go through the presentation. And you can see the flowchart ends at the bottom with the police commissioner making the ultimate decision about the discipline that an officer receives. Although we know that some cases can go further than the police department and end up at arbitration and sometimes get overturned at arbitration, the goal is really to go back up and through this flowchart improve every step of the way so that we can sort of hopefully prevent those cases from being overturned at arbitration in the future. The idea is that if the discipline process overall from the charging unit, the PBI hearings, if that's all more thorough, more consistent, then there hopefully is less of a case at the arbitration stage. And part 2 of the report is going to focus on some of the other pieces of this flowchart and these other pieces of the discipline process, such as the training and counseling option that's sort of up next to the charging unit. And also command level discipline, it's outlined in red on the slide. That's when commanders at a district or a unit can use their discretion to decide what an officer's discipline will be when the possible penalty is relatively minor. And we hope to examine the use of command level discipline, understand how it's used, and same with training and counseling. So that's something we've reserved for a future project or future report in sort of this project to understand how everything's used. So I'll turn it back over to Angelica. She's going to go through some of the data findings and discuss the recommendations that resulted from some of our findings.
Thanks, Janine. So before the collaboration plan was even drafted, the PAC recruited and partnered with a group of academics with experience evaluating police data. And they were so critical to this project. Unfortunately, they weren't able to be here tonight, but they amassed a lot of experience from operations, methodologies, economics, statistics, and they were comprised of experts from Princeton, University of Pennsylvania, Wharton, and also the University of California, Irvine. So even though the PAC is just a group of 6, our data partners were about 6 or 7 academics who spent this last year just focused on this data. So once the collaboration plan was agreed upon between the PPD and the PAC, we worked with our data partners to develop an initial data request that we submitted to PPD. So the request was, the actual request, this slide, thanks. So the actual request, we included it on page 58 in the report, and we requested all investigative files from complaints against police between 2015 to September 2020, and all PBI hearing documents, as well as the audio recordings of those documents from 2015 to September 2020, as well as training documents and all other relevant documents. So over the course of several months, we all really got familiar with one another transferring this data. So altogether, the PAC received over 9,000 allegations across 3,500 civilian complaints, as well as over 140 audio recordings from disciplinary hearings and other relevant documents. But the main findings by the data team were reflected here in this slide. First, the team discovered that on average, it took internal affairs about 6 months to investigate a complaint. And we thought that was an area of concern because the executive order that guides how internal affairs is supposed to conduct their investigations sets the ideal time frame as 90 days. So it was taking internal affairs about double the length of time to complete the investigations. Second, it was discovered that 36% of the complaints that are categorized as department violations actually involved very serious allegations that were just called department violation. The third data finding was that 86% of the complaints are dismissed from internal affairs. So that means that they were not sustained. And this is from 2015 to September 2020. And that number is 86%. So the cases that were sustained, which means internal affairs did find evidence for the violation, for the misconduct, 76% of those sustained complaints were diverted to a program called training and counseling, which is what Janine was just referring to. It's not a diversionary program. And lastly, most of the penalty that was imposed was merely a reprimand and not a suspension. So their full report is found on page 64 of the report. We know it's a massive report, it's about 250 pages, but if you have the time, it'll be great if you can look for the stats folks. If you want to look at the numbers, we included all of the numbers in the report starting on page 64. Can you go to the next slide, Annie? Thank you. So our goal for objective 1 was to fully explore how complaints are processed, both civilian-led and internally initiated investigations to determine if the process is fair and equitable across the department. So unfortunately, this objective had to be saved for part 2 of this project, but we wanted to emphasize to the community that, exploring this topic is still our priority, and we've already started a conversation of how we can best dive deep into this area. But fortunately, some of our initial findings from the other objectives was able to reveal some preliminary findings. So the data partners discovered that it took on average 9 days for internal affairs to assign an investigator to a complaint. And additionally, 181 days to complete the investigation. So what we want to do is really dive deep into like the life of the complaint, like Janine was referring to. So we're hoping to have that part in part 2. Could you go to the next slide, Annie? Thank you. So when we embarked on this project, the first goal was to try to completely immerse ourselves in the disciplinary system so that we could adequately pinpoint which areas contribute to missed opportunities for accountability. And of all of the areas that we looked at, the first one that we wanted to discuss was the charging unit. As Jane explained earlier, the charging unit determines what official charge should be imposed on misconduct. And these charges come from a little booklet called a disciplinary code, which determines what charge is applicable. So before we did a deep dive of how these charges were made, though, we learned that, like I said before, 76% of the sustained allegations were not given formal charges. Instead, they were diverted to the diversionary program, training and counseling. So we wanted to investigate training and counseling and try to wrap our head around it. So we learned that there wasn't a clear policy outlining which types of cases were appropriate for training and counseling. We discovered that training and counseling was used for some forced allegations, for allegations involving constitutional rights, and other types of allegations. And unfortunately, we also found that training and counseling was even utilized for officers with repeated infractions against them. So it was not a process for first-time, complaints. So this led to our first recommendation in the report for PPD to work with CPOC in developing an appropriate policy for training and counseling, one that can narrow the scope of how it's used and can really be transparent within the department and amongst the public and the residents about how is training and counseling used. So for the officers that did not receive training and counseling, the charging unit will review the disciplinary code to determine which charges were appropriate and which charges matched the sustained allegation. So in this review, we actually learned that many of the charges that were used were either insufficient or they were inapplicable. So we list several of these examples throughout the report, but mainly they're found in the summary section, which is found on page 115. So some of these sustained allegations from internal affairs, when they arrived at charging, some of the charges that were used to describe the incident didn't actually reflect what happened. So I just want to go over an example of this. An example was an officer who threatened to disseminate sensitive pictures of the mother of his child if she didn't do what he asked. The charging unit characterized this conduct as conduct unbecoming unspecified. So the PAC's review, however, of the disciplinary code revealed that there were several other charges that could have adequately described this behavior. And that was conduct unbecoming engaging in threatening behavior, conduct unbecoming engaging in inappropriate communication, conduct unbecoming sexual harassment, and even conduct unbecoming engaging in criminal activity. So this is just one example where the PAC really did a deep dive of every single case and discovered that there were several charges that were not being charged and that the charges were not matching. So this led to recommendations 2 through 3, which we're asking for PPD to charge all applicable charges and even allow CPOC the abilities to review for accuracy and completeness. So overall, we discovered that the charging unit is very important when it comes to the disciplinary process. And this is actually a part of the process that isn't really talked about in the public or in the media when we discuss police reform and the disciplinary reform. So charging, we believe, has been left out of the discussion, and these decisions really determine what evidence will be presented to the panel, the range of discipline that could be imposed if an officer is found guilty, and overall, whether the officer will be found guilty or not. So objective 2 really just does a deep dive of the charging unit. Could you go to the next one, Danny? Thanks. So the next objective, objective 3, was to review the department advocates' processes and procedures. And for this review, we not only reviewed the hearings themselves, but also the preparation for the hearings, including how complainants were notified. So we found that even though many of the notifications were timely, which means the department advocate provided the complainant at least 30 days notice of the hearing, many of these notices were actually returned to internal affairs because the complainant no longer resided at the address. And so this was actually great data that was in the file. Like if a notice was returned, the actual return envelope was included in the file. So our data partners found that it took on average 463 days from the filing of the complaint to when the hearing actually occurred. And we believe this could contribute to the unavailability of a witness or complainant. So in the consequence of this is the FOP being able to successfully argue to the panel that the allegation is not credible because there's no complainant here to share their story. So unfortunately, we found documented accounts showing that the reason why some officers were found not guilty for the allegation was because a complainant had failed to appear. So this led to recommendations 4 through 5 that really gets at making sure we're doing everything that we can, to find complainants and notify them of the process. So we're asking for this notification to take place over several different pathways, not just the mail, but text message, phone calls, even email. And if a complainant does not appear for the hearing, for the department advocate to at least ask for a continuance to make sure that proper notice was given. And if the complainant may have changed their address or other types of communications. So our review of the department advocates procedures also included asking PPD personnel themselves about the process, which are shared throughout the report. The entire report is lined from testimonials from members who have served on the PBI board. So the PAC submitted a confidential survey to these members asking how they felt about the process, things that they would change. And one thing that we found is that a few of them shared their reluctance and hesitation to impose discipline against another member of the department. So the current structure of how the PBI panel works is that out of 3, at least 2 must find someone guilty. So it has to be at least 2-to-1 finding for guilty. And for the penalty decision at the time of this report, it had to be unanimous for the penalty decision. So we got this understanding from the survey results, interviews that we conducted, and that helped frame recommendations 8 through 11, which overall includes involving civilians in this process and reframing how this disciplinary decisions are even shared to begin with. And I'll just share an example for that. So in recommendation 10, we are asking for jury verdict forms to be used to narrow the scope of the panel's review. And this was discovered from researching if there is a relationship between the questions you ask a jury and their conclusion. And the results that we found was that if you ask a jury if someone is guilty or not, they usually will place themselves in the accused person's shoes. And they have now transformed the question from, is this person guilty or not, or to, would I have done this action if I was in this person's shoes? So we think that that's not the actual question that the panel should be asked. And so what we're instead asking is, did this officer violate policy? So, and we have a recorded incident of this happening, which is included in the report on page 23. We describe a complaint whereby an officer actually kicked a handcuffed person in the face. And even though the department had a policy prohibiting kicks, the panel found the officer not guilty because they believe the officer used everything within his toolbox to de-escalate the situation. So the panel pretty much put themselves in the officer's shoes, saying that we would have done the same thing. So we describe this practice as a form of jury nullification. And we wanted to create a process whereby the panel's focus is narrowed so that nullification can be minimized. So overall for this objective, we believe by including civilians in this process and by narrowing the panel's specific questions that they're asked, among other things, could enhance the department's overall process. Okay, that was a lot to say. Danny, could you go to the next slide, please? So after we reviewed the process, we wanted to then do a deep dive into the effectiveness of the advocate, which uncovered 3 main findings. First, we found that after charging decisions were made, it took an average of 197 days for a hearing to be held. So this finding influenced recommendation 14, which was to dedicate more personnel to the prosecution role. Second, we found that the department advocate allowed some charges to be withdrawn in exchange for guilty pleas, which allowed some very serious conduct to appear minor on the paper after the guilty plea went through. So an example of this was an officer who had someone's car towed because he believed the person hit his personal vehicle, the front bumper of it. The officer told a truck driver that the woman was driving without a valid license, even though she did have a valid license. So her car was towed. She went through a lengthy process to get her car back. And the charging unit originally charged this conduct as abuse of authority. And the officer was actually able to plead guilty to failure to conduct a proper investigation. So we believe, by the officer being allowed to plead guilty, it kind of shields the actual context of what happened. So this finding led to recommendation 15, which is that charges that challenge the officer's character, credibility, honesty should not be withdrawn in exchange for guilty pleas. And a third finding, as it relates to the effectiveness of the department advocate, was that many panelists did not know the proper standard of proof for this procedure. So the survey results found that only 42% of those who completed the survey were able to select the proper standard of proof, which is preponderance of the evidence. And only 21% recall receiving the instruction of what this standard is during the hearing. In addition to the survey, we found many documents that reflect the board members documenting that they found someone not guilty because the department advocate did not prove their case beyond a reasonable doubt. And so beyond a reasonable doubt is actually reserved for like the highest level, which is a criminal standard. And so a lot of panelists are applying a criminal standard to this administrative hearing. And so we're hoping recommendation 16 could remedy this by asking the department advocate to clearly define what preponderance of the evidence is and to frequently cite it throughout the process. Now Janine will discuss objective number 5.
So objective 5 was all about the accessibility of PBI hearings. So the goal here was to evaluate how accessible PBI hearings are and the impact of this accessibility on officers and civilian complainants. So part of this ongoing project is sending a survey out to residents of the city and residents who have gone through the discipline process. So some of this objective will be addressed once this resident survey has been completed, so we can understand the barriers that people experience while going through this process and understanding how their trust in this process may be improved. But PBI hearings had some obvious gaps in accessibility that we wanted to address right away. So from attending PBI hearings over the last few years, PAC staff had noticed that although they're technically open to the public, the PBI hearing room was too small to have more than maybe one member of the public attend. And this is an issue that's come up at our public meetings many times over the last couple of years. Further, the front desk policy that was being used at the PPD headquarters for allowing civilians to access the hearings was not clear enough. And we heard stories from residents who had tried to attend these hearings, but faced a lot of difficulty in actually accessing the room and attending the hearings as they wanted to. So one of our recommendations was to make sure this policy is rewritten so that it's very clear and that civilians are denied access to these hearings unless there's some outstanding reason to do so. And as the new hearing space will be set up in the new headquarters building, more space will be included for observers to attend. This is something that we know is important to PPD as they've been designing their new space at the new building. And we know that over the last year that we've all adapted to using technology for many new purposes. And this allowed us to think creatively about accessibility to these PBI hearings. As Angelica mentioned earlier, the presence of civilian complainants and witnesses at these hearings is really important when PBI panel members are making their decisions. They use it to assess the credibility of the complaint, and in-person testimony is always very important in any sort of hearing. So this recommendation to make virtual testimony an option can hopefully increase accessibility and get people the opportunity to participate in these hearings, even if they can't be there in person. We know that people can't attend these hearings for any number of good reasons, be it work or they've moved out of the city. And those shouldn't be a barrier to people who actually do want to participate and do care about their complaint. And also we found that not much information about PBI hearings is available to the public. The rules about how these hearings occur, how PBI board members are selected and trained, other procedural issues, they aren't currently collected or available in one central location, even to officers who may want to fully understand these processes. So we recommended that some standard operating procedures be formally written down and made available to the public and members of the department so that this process is more transparent to everyone who may come into contact with it. And we also wanted to make sure that a hearing calendar is made available to the public so that people can attend these hearings more easily as they are public hearings and people do want to go to them. So that's sort of the accessibility portion, but there will be more on this after the resident survey is completed. Back to you, Angelica.
Thanks, Janine. So as Janine stated, we did have a few objectives that we just could not get to. Our report is already 258 pages pages long, I believe. So we're reserving objective 6 for the next report, just really to check in on the progress of the first report's recommendations and to see if there is any movement on adding civilians to this process, to talk about more about how individuals are going to be selected and trained to be a part of this process. And for objective 7, we're actually seeking feedback from the community, like Janine said, and the PAC, in collaboration with our data partners, are releasing a survey this summer, and we will incorporate the results of that survey in part 2. However, as we were working through all of these objectives, we did find other subject areas that we wanted to include in this report. Danny, could you go to the next slide, please? Thank you. So the first related to department directives. In many instances, officers we believe escaped accountability because there was not a specific policy prohibiting the behavior. And even when the department did amend their directives after the fact to try to prevent this from happening in the future, the new amendment continued to be ineffective. And the report outlines a few examples of this occurring. And so with recommendation 24, we're asking for PPD as well as CPOC to conduct post-trial verdict audits to ensure policies are actively reflected within legal standards, and that every time there is not just a PBI hearing, but just any type of charge or case that comes through, we are making sure that there is a directive that has touched on this issue. And the last subject that we discussed really deals with, Dana, could you go to the next slide, please? Thank you. Dealt with the disciplinary penalty that is imposed. So the PAC reviewed disciplinary findings and as well as arbitration decisions, and found that even though the decisions are usually a reprimand, even though when there's a decision that was more than a reprimand, those instances were frequently grieved by the FOP and may have been reversed altogether during arbitration or lowered during arbitration. And we reviewed some of the arbiters' decisions and found that a lot of times they reverse a penalty decision because they believe the commissioner did not explain the penalty decision. So the PAC believes in the last recommendation with a disciplinary matrix, the commissioner could be better equipped to explain their decisions and have their decisions remain intact after arbitration. So the reason why this is important is because the overwhelming majority of the disciplinary code has a range. It's not just one penalty if you have this infraction. And the range is usually a reprimand to 5 days suspension for a first offense of misconduct. With not that much other guidance for how to make a determination of where someone is going to land between that range, where if someone's going to receive a reprimand or 2 days or 5 days, or maybe even something more. And so we really reviewed how other departments across the nation was addressing this. And the NYPD has this process already, which is the disciplinary matrix. And we discuss it in the report. And they have their report that is accessible to the public. So not only does the public know exactly how much time or, what type of training that an officer may receive for misconduct, but internally amongst themselves, the personnel have a better understanding of what type of discipline could be imposed. So we believe having PPD and CPOC create this matrix could enhance internal and external transparency as it relates to disciplinary penalties, and may even provide the commissioner an additional tool to help during the disciplinary and even arbitration process. So that was a very brief overview of the 250-page report. And now we have Deputy Commissioner Nash and Lieutenant Richardson here from the Philadelphia Police Department, who are going to share the progress of the recommendations and also as well as their part in the collaboration. Thanks for being here, y'all.
Okay, I think I'm off mute. Is that right? Can you hear me, Danny? All right.
Yeah.
Well, Angelica and Janine, thank you for an outstanding presentation. I want to commend everybody who worked on the report. It was collaborative. Sometimes there were some frustrations with obtaining some of the information, but I have to say up front, and I'll give a little bit of background, but when I first saw the report, I was truly impressed with how insightful everybody the report was, and how a lot of the issues that I recognized were raised. Real quick background for everybody on the meeting. My name is Ben Nash. My position is Deputy Commissioner for Investigations. I primarily oversee our Detective Bureau, our Narcotics Bureau, and working with that. But one of the other added responsibilities that has been given to me is to oversee our PBI, our Police Board of Inquiry process as a whole. And in that capacity, as Angelica and Janine went through the different processes, the charging unit comes under my purview, as well as the department advocate or the actual PBI hearings. And I want to give some real quick background on that without going too long. So I've been doing this in this position now for a little less than a year. I'm with the department for 32 years, and I've served primarily in investigations. I've sat in the past on a number of boards in the role as the board president, as a captain or as an inspector. I recognize a lot of the challenges that the Police Advisory Commission has identified. And shortly upon my assuming this role, it became clear that we do have to make a number of changes. So the slide that is up on your screen is recognizing that of the 27 recommendations that were so very thoughtfully and comprehensively articulated by Janine and by Angelica, even before this process got started, in my capacity overseeing the process, I had already implemented essentially 5 of these recommendations prior to the report even coming out. And a lot of them are recognized as issues that we've had discussions with. And when I say we, I think it's important to recognize the incredible devotion to this process that Police Commissioner Outlaw has had from the time of her start in February of 2020. So I started at the end of June of 2020 and didn't quite know what I was getting into, especially with the PBI role, but quickly found that what we're doing is recognizing the flaws. So many of them have been pointed out, and I've been chipping away trying to make some adjustments that I have the capacity, the authority to do on my own. A lot of the, you'll see, as you can see from my slide, accepted with barriers. And I just want to give a quick explanation. In a number of the issues that are raised by the PAC, what we have are issues that cannot necessarily be unilaterally changed as a result of past practice, precedent, as it pertains to our collective bargaining agreement. One of the last things that was kind of touched on was virtual in this time of pandemic and moving from in-person meetings to virtual meetings. And yet, while we were shut down for an extended period because of all of the issues related to pandemic, when we talked about getting ourselves back up and running with virtual meetings, we got some resistance from our FOP, from the FOP itself. And for reasons that are beyond necessity for this discussion, it wasn't able to get going. So real quick, without me trying not to go too long, I'm trying to keep it, I'm at my 5-minute mark. I do want to touch on some of the critical recommendations that have already been addressed that I think go towards the collaboration and the direction that we're moving. So I'm going to ask Danny to go to slide 6, which has to do with, I think it's objective, and let me just double check on mine. Yeah, so objective 2, exactly. So the recommendation, and I'm going to speak kind of specifically because these are things that were brought to light by the commission, by the report. But as I say, this had already been recognized well before the report. Remember, I think the report goes back looking at a time period of over 5 years ago. And the recommendation was in bringing charges against police personnel for sustained misconduct. Charging authorities should bring all charges that are applicable. When I got here, I started hearing the concerns that were expressed by the commissioner, by the deputy commissioner for our Office of Professional Responsibility, that the charging unit wasn't doing the charging unit's job properly. And that became a issue that I addressed with at the time, the person who was the commanding officer of the unit, recognizing that the overriding discretion that person may have felt rested within his or her discretion or his or her position in that position. In fact, we should be charging what is sustained by internal affairs. So we had some issues, and the short version is there was a change made at the charging unit, and now we have a person who's in charge of that unit who also has internal affairs experience. And I think that we're going to be able to really address that problem is essentially eliminated. Go to the next slide, number 7. And in the recommendation about talking about voting sheets should require each member of the PBI board to document their recommendations to the commissioner. And I know this is part of the objective regarding their findings and their disciplinary recommendations, if applicable. A little bit of history. Previously, if the finding was not guilty, the person in charge of the board, the president of the board, as we call that person, which is generally a captain or higher, would have the responsibility to prepare a memorandum explaining why the board voted it not guilty. Though that was only being done at the time when at least two members of the board would find that there was not enough preponderance of the evidence in order to have a finding of guilty. And in the discussions that I have with the commission on a weekly basis as we review the findings of the PBI board, we recognize that we really need the rationale. So what I had instituted around the time that the report came out, but just prior to it, was that as we move forward, the board president is required to submit a memo explaining the rationale for the finding, as well as the rationale for the penalty recommendations, whether it's for guilty or not guilty. There was also a reference during the presentation about the unanimous need for the recommendation, and that has actually been eliminated. If somebody is of the mindset that the accused officer should not be found guilty, it doesn't make any sense for them to be a part of the recommendation for the penalty. So that has been unilaterally withdrawn as well. The next slide, number 8, there are a number of recommendations, including number 15, charges that challenge the character, credibility, honesty of the officer should not be withdrawn in exchange for guilty pleas. Well, this one, we really have to credit the police commissioner who recognized that if an internal affairs investigation sustained allegations against an individual officer, especially pertaining to character, credibility, honesty, that they ought not to have an opportunity to have those charges withdrawn in exchange for a guilty plea. So as discretion was taken away from the charging commanding officer, there has also been discretion that's been taken away from the department advocate. So that's no longer a possibility. The board is going to have to explain their findings based on the substance of the hearing combined with what was uncovered during the course of the investigation. And if it's there, the board is expected to find guilt. And if it's not there, they would explain why they find a person, an accused officer, is not guilty. So we've moved forward with that. And also on this slide, there was the reference to the standard of evidence for ID investigations and PBI hearings being clearly defined in all public and internal documents related to discipline process, including but not limited to the Directive 8.6 and the PBI board voting sheets. It should be recited to the PBI board members at every PBI hearing. I understand that during the course of undertaking the report and the background, that there may have been some reports that made their way to the from surveys that people were under the impression that guilt beyond a reasonable doubt was the threshold. I can affirm to everyone that the department advocate clearly articulates the actual and the fact that accused officers who have been sustained for wrongdoing, that the finding should be based on preponderance of the evidence. So I've reemphasized to the department advocate that his responsibility is to make it absolutely clear the preponderance of evidence is the standard that we're utilizing, not beyond a reasonable doubt, as they would be using in a criminal trial. So I think that there's just, frankly, I believe there's some lack of communication on the part of some of the board members. And for those that we find seem to have an unreasonable standard when it comes to disciplinary findings, they're not being seated on the boards as we move forward. So we've taken that step as well. And then finally, moving to slide number 12, really talking about in the recommendation 25, where officers are accused and found to have violated individuals' constitutional or Pennsylvania constitutional rights, that they should be held accountable. I can assert that we do have policy on detention of individuals, and where an investigation is determined that an individual has been held against their constitutional rights and the IAD finding is able to sustain it, they are held for departmental violations. And if the case that's presented at the time of the hearing is such that it's made out, they're going to be found guilty. And again, let me reemphasize that now that there is a review process that goes on, there's each individual case is specifically reviewed with the police commissioner, myself, our Office of Professional Responsibility, Deputy Commissioner, as well as a member of the law department. So Commissioner Outlaw has taken what was, I think, in the previous administrations, a more acceptance of whatever the board's findings were, and there is a significant review of each and every case. I've already gone to about 15 minutes, so I'm not going to go through everything else. I'm just going to reemphasize as we go back to the slide on number 13 that has where we are. Of the remaining recommendations, of the 27 recommendations, those I've indicated we've already implemented. There are a couple that we implemented immediately upon receiving the PAC's recommendations, and a number of them. The simplest one is really recommendation number 22, the recording that the police department should record the entirety of the hearings. That includes the closing arguments. And that was another recommendation that, frankly, nobody had a good answer as to why it wasn't done. And so that has been implemented right upon the receipt of the recommendation. So we have a number of recommendations that we've taken to right away. A number of them are in progress. And then there are a significant number of them, and I'm not going to go through each and every one of them, that do involve collective bargaining issues that are going to have to be worked out. And as Angelica and Janine clearly articulated about the timing of this report, part of why it's so important is that the city is in negotiations with our Fraternal Order of Police for our contract, which is going to expire at the end of this month. And part of what the representatives for the city are presenting will incorporate a number of the changes that we're hopeful can be bargained for so that we can move forward and enact a lot of the recommendations that the PAC has provided and guided us with. So with that, I'm going to conclude my portion and turn it back over to Danny. And I'm here and willing and able to take any questions from the police side on any of the information that was presented from myself or questions that Angelica and Janine have raised. So thank you all for inviting me and giving me an opportunity to talk.
Thank you. Danny, before we open it up, I just had one question of Deputy Commissioner Nash. So thank you very much for the report on how the recommendations from the fine report that Angelica and Janine put together. Have you summarized those responses in any place so that folks who are looking at the report can then line that up with the recommendations?
Yes, we, my staff and myself, we're putting together a matrix that indicates where we are on things. And I'll be glad to provide that up to Anthony, and he can distribute that as he sees fit. So you can see the specific recommendations, where we stand on things, what we're trying to do and what we've accomplished and what we're working towards.
Thanks very much. I think it would be helpful when we're sharing the report publicly to be sharing this as kind of the next part of the story, if you will. So thank you. Danny, I turn it back to you now.
Great. I had one question right away. Sean, I'm going to unmute you. And if anybody else has questions, you can use the raise your hand feature or send the questions directly to me in the chat. Oops, Sean.
Okay. I will let Miss Gal go. I will let the community go first, and then I will ask my question.
Okay, great. Gail, I'm going to unmute you.
Okay, hi, everybody. First, I just want to say I thought this was an excellent report. So Anthony and Janine and Angelica, it was excellent. And also thank you, Deputy Commissioner Nash. I was interested at the end when you were talking about the advisory disciplinary matrix and wondered about how this relates to the disciplinary code in the contract. And then hearing Deputy Commissioner, you talk about how this, well, I'm wondering if this is one of those things that will be impacted at the contract level. And then how will that, how will we know what's worked out in the contract bargaining right now for this year's or for this current contract negotiation?
So thanks for that question. The contract negotiations, I believe they're open to the public. I know that members of the department are attending, as well as the members of city government and the executive staff. How it's going to relate to the disciplinary code? Well, a little bit of quick background. When there were changes to the disciplinary code going back around 10 years ago that were proposed, it took a number of years to negotiate with the FOP to get those changes to the code accepted as a new code. There had been an old code. So there is established precedent that if we're going to change the code, we're going to have to negotiate that. If it's done unilaterally, there will likely be a grievance, and there could be a labor practice issue raised. So right now, the code stands, but as Angelica mentioned and Janine mentioned, there was talk about a matrix.
Right.
Now the matrix, which is utilized in New York City and other large agencies, is something that I personally believe, and I've had discussions with the commissioner, we feel that we could essentially start to establish a standard of what penalty should be under mitigated. There's three categories: mitigated and
Aggravating.
aggravated. Thank you. Thanks, Janine. And then middle of the road. And we've pulled the New York City's matrix. And I don't have an answer that we're going to be able to specifically go right to that, but we're working with the PAC to put that together. And I don't see a hurdle in a matrix for the disciplinary code. I hope that answers your question.
Okay, thank you. Thanks.
Great. Kristen, you are my next hand raised.
Yes. I have 3 questions, and I apologize if a giant cat gets on my screen. My first question is how do you decide if something is just for like a disciplinary administrative hearing or if it's a criminal proceeding? Because I'm pretty sure that police can break the law sometimes.
All right, can I jump on that before you go to question 2 and 3? Because that's a really simple one.
Okay.
This goes back to the internal affairs process, which is before the PBI, which is before the disciplinary process.
Okay.
If there is an allegation of criminal activity committed by a police officer, the investigation has to be cleared by the district attorney's office before it can go administratively.
Okay.
So before it can even go to the PBI, if there is any potential aspect of what is alleged to have occurred was a criminal act, that can't go administratively until the district attorney's office has declined any charges, if it can be sustained, if there can be a case that is made that what is alleged to have occurred did occur. And that all depends on where the internal affairs investigation leads.
Okay, I got to tack on an extra question because I really like that voice of authority. My second question is, can somebody choose their own advocate? Like, are you just kind of like stuck with whoever you're assigned to?
When you say advocate, are you talking about the department advocate?
If you have a complaint and you're going through the, I guess, PBI or whatever, and this is.
You're talking about, I'm sorry, but are you talking about the complainant making the complaint against the police or the police officer?
The advocate that's, I guess, working with the person through the process.
So, I think this would clarify. The department receives complaints against police. As things stand right now, if a complaint is received against a police officer, there is no choosing of where it goes. Internal Affairs Division, IAD, investigates that complaint. There is a corollary, there is a accompanying watchdog being, as things are right now with the PAC, they can participate in that complaint investigation portion, but they don't have the inherent ability to bring charges on their own. It has to go through our internal affairs in order to make it administratively or even criminally. So you don't get, so no person gets to choose who you can go to internal affairs as a complainant, as a civilian. You can go straight to internal affairs, make the complaint, or you can go to the PAC, make the complaint, and it'll go to internal affairs. Now the CPOC is looking to restructure this whole complaint process, and I can't begin to touch on that, but I'm just giving you how it works now. PAC can get a complaint and they'll work with internal affairs.
Okay, and my third question, and I'm not a lawyer, I'm just a person, graphic designer, but it seems like the police department, or rather, is like judge, jury, and executioner, and I'm using that metaphorically.
Thank you.
In this, but you know, there was a case that came to my attention not too long ago where FOP President John McNesby commented on before it even went before a hearing. And he, without a doubt, removed the what do you call it? The credibility of the person making the accusation.
Okay, so so Kristen, again, it goes back to if it's a criminal matter, and that's part of the job of internal affairs. If they can substantiate, sustain that a criminal matter occurred. Remember, you've got to establish probable cause on any criminal matter against a police officer. You're not dealing with the police board of inquiry. You're not dealing with administrative. The DA's office will bring charges, and it has nothing to do with the police officer. So we're not judge, jury, and executioner there. If there is no support for a criminal allegation to go forward from the DA's office and charges to go in front of a judge and or a jury, then we're talking about administrative, procedural violations of the department, for which ultimately it's not this police board of inquiry. Ultimately, it is the police commissioner that has the final determination. And one of the things that may not have been clear from when I spoke about it or from the entire presentation is in this police board of inquiry, we call it this PBI process. The PBI board, who may hear a administrative case against a police officer for departmental violations or for an act that they should be punished for, all they are doing is giving a recommendation to the police commissioner.
Okay.
Okay, so if the police commissioner unilaterally, either before it goes to PBI or after it goes to PBI, wants to take action, the police commissioner always has the authority to do that. And the police commissioner has the sole authority to determine the final outcome of the disciplinary recommendation that any discipline. All right, so I get where you're coming from, but it's John McNesby, the president of the FOP aside, his job is to advocate for the police officers. It may seem like he's polluting the process, but all he's doing is he's doing what he is charged to do by the membership. Hope that answers your question.
I just had my two concerns were, is that appropriate? I get that he's, you know, defending or representing
freedom of speech.
You know, he's representing, you know, the union. I understand that. I have lots of union family members. But the other thing is that I really have huge concerns about members of the public that have mental illnesses, that don't have autism, that have cognitive disabilities, that aren't able to really, you know, articulate what they need to say. So I wonder how much in this process that this has been like really just like thought about.
So remember, the complaints, the allegations are complaints and allegations. It's right as things stand now. It's the responsibility of the police department's internal affairs, Office of Professional Responsibility, to do an investigation and see if there is supporting evidence to bring charges, whether they be criminal, that would be probable cause charges to the district attorney's office, or administrative, and that would be preponderance of the evidence to move forward with something to potentially discipline an officer.
Okay.
So you have different advocates. John McNesby, as the president of the FOP, is the advocate for the officers at all times. He does it extremely well, but it doesn't interfere with the process. And I understand where you're coming from, but that's where we are. That's really where we are pretty much across the country.
And just so we're fair, I don't just advocate for the public that's mentally ill. I also advocate for police officers too.
Well, if the police officers have mental illness, then we have a fitness for duty requirement, and they can be relieved of their duty.
Well, everybody experiences some kind of mental illness in their lifetime. doesn't have to be severe. You don't have to have the big three.
We have good counseling for the officers. It's, we have that with the department. So thank you. But I appreciate your concerns.
And Kristen, the one of the things that the PAC has done and what CPOC will do in the future is to assist in this process, in this complaint process, is kind of meeting people where they are and figuring out how to best serve them and how to best articulate their concerns and drill it down. Like, for example, when someone comes in, if anyone makes a complaint to the PAC, the idea, one of the primary functions that we serve in that process is really sort of translation and articulation, right? So because the people that come to us or come through us with complaints have experienced trauma of some kind, and we try to make sure that the issue that they're trying to transmit gets transmitted effectively and practically and quickly. And that's a service that is unique to us and will be unique to CPOC. We try to get, we really work hard to try to make sure that whoever comes to us, their concerns are really translated and articulated appropriately to give it the best chance of a successful investigation.
I appreciate that a lot. Hasn't always been the case. I don't want to take up too much other time.
Thank you for those
Thanks for your questions, Kristen.
We appreciate them. The next question I had was, can information about how to attend contract negotiations be shared with the public? Is that meeting public?
I don't know the answer to that.
I believe they are public. I don't have the specific information at this moment where they are. If I can get that, I will share it with Anthony and we'll make it available.
Great, awesome. If they are, then we will we'll share those on our website or social media in some way. The next question, I'm gonna pop over to Sean.
First of all, I just want to say excellent job to all y'all on this report, research and data gathering. So good job to all y'all, especially to Angelica. Awesome job. One question I have, like, say if the police officer or his advocate tried to use qualified immunity because they have that under the law. How can y'all fight so that officer cannot use that excuse?
Well, that doesn't apply to this particular process. That's more for civil court. But in the administrative prosecution of police misconduct, qualified immunity does not protect officers from being found guilty or not guilty.
Oh, thank you. I never knew that until now. Okay, thanks. Okay, that's it.
Thanks, Sean.
Gail, I had you next again. Oop, you're still muted, Gail. There we go.
In the, I guess, recommendation 8 or around there, it was, you were talking about including civilians in the process. Who would be the civilians that would be included, and what would they be part of the panel?
Right. So in that section, we're discussing having civilians during the PBI hearing process as panelists, as well as civilians functioning as department advocate. And so if we weren't clear, the department advocate is sort of like the PPD's internal prosecutor, where this is the individual who has the responsibility to meet the burden of preponderance of the evidence standard by presenting the case, calling witnesses, asking people to testify, presenting evidence. So that is the role of the department advocate. And so in the report, we're asking for that role to include civilian participation as well, and also for panelists to be included in the role. And so in that section, we discuss how in other jurisdictions, they have civilians incorporated during that process.
Would those civilians be from the CPOC or would they be chosen from the community?
Well, what we're hoping for is that in part 2, we can really dive deep into that section for it. And so we've included some of those questions in the survey, asking residents and complainants what will make them feel more comfortable as far as cooperation with the process. Like if you knew that the department advocate was, a civilian person who can assist, or if you knew that there would be civilian panelists, and really tried to see, what functions there could better improve the turnout, as well as the appearance, and also the practicality of like, what is it equitable? Is it transparent? So we really want to see how can civilians play a role, not just CPOC, but just residents as well in all of those functions.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks, Gail.
The next question we had in the chat was, is the arbitration contract different from the regular basic contract?
I'll touch on that. So we the police are regulated in the state. I think it's Act 111. I hope I have my act number right, which essentially says that police will be governed by a contract. That contract should be negotiated between the police representatives along with the government for which they're working. If a agreement cannot be made, then the determination will be made by an arbitration process. And in simple terms, this is the way of eliminating a possible strike by your police officers because they don't have a contract. Like in other governmental organizations, if a contract isn't reached, they can say, see ya, we're not picking up your garbage. We can't do that. We're the police. We're here 24/7. And the state has said in this Commonwealth, that's how it will be regulated. There are numerous jurisdictions, a lot of places where the two parties get together. The chief of police, the head of the government administration, whether it be a mayor or a town administrator, and the unions all get together, they hash things out, they bargain a little bit, and they come up with an agreement. That probably happens in most of the places throughout the state. It generally does not happen in Philadelphia. We've traditionally gone to an arbitration process. That arbitration is what's known as binding. And as a result, both sides present, the city presents what it wants to provide. The bargaining unit or the FOP provides what it's looking for. And there is a solo arbitrator. There's a panel of 3. One side is selected by the city, one side is selected by the FOP, and then there's somebody that both sides agree to, and essentially the person in the middle makes the determination as to what that contract will look like. It has to do with wages, benefits, as well as workplace rules. And what we're talking about with this whole PBI process is really the workplace rules. And that's where the arbitration contract will have an impact on how we are able to institute our disciplinary process. So I hope that answers that question.
Great. I think that's all the questions I have in the chat.
Marnie had a question, Danny.
Let me go to them. Hold on, I'm unmuting you now, Marnie. There we go.
In answer to one of the questions I heard, I think Anthony say that there is not qualified immunity for police. I thought that was the huge stumbling block of Act 111.
Just in the PBI process, it does not protect them. That's a civil court process that they can be protected by. But in the internal administrative adjudication process, it does the police are judged based on the facts and the facts alone.
But then the union comes in for an arbitration, right?
Well, possibly. That's always a possibility. It depends on how the process plays out. But the example would be that, like, if I'm a police officer and I engage in misconduct and I'm found guilty in PBI, and then the complainant sues me over the conduct later, then you know that they could possibly come in to play in that form, but not in the administrative discipline form.
It seems as if the entire process takes place within the police department, the internal affairs. And in regular trials, you have lawyers for both sides. I don't see that there's a strong, and maybe that's where the new CPOC comes in, that there would be strong advocacy for the people who are making complaints. Otherwise, you make a complaint, the police department decides on it. You know.
Yeah, I mean, and really that's the point of this project, right? The point of this project was, one of the primary problems with the process as it existed was that let's say everything went perfectly and everybody did everything right, you couldn't believe it, you couldn't trust it, right? And if everything went wrong, you couldn't believe it and you couldn't trust it. And part of this reform process and project is to create a system that when an officer is found guilty of misconduct, it sticks. And when an officer is found not guilty of misconduct, you can believe it, right? Like, so making this process more competent and transparent should allow the public to have confidence in it. So, and part of the reforms outlined in this process is enhanced prosecution. You have, like, and with the CPOC legislation, you're talking about administrative prosecution it's handled by civilians potentially. All of these things are designed to make an internal adjudication process, you know, more fair for the officer, more fair for the complainant, and something that can be trusted by both.
Danny, I think we're coming close to the end of our time. Do we have any other questions?
I don't. I will share in the chat right now our sign up for our mailing list. If you are not already on our mailing list and would like to join, that's where we send links for meetings as well as other updates for the PAC.
Okay. So our next meeting is tentatively scheduled for July 19th, and that's tentative.
12th.
Pardon?
It is scheduled for the 12th.
Okay, the agenda says the 19th, but
oh, sorry,
that's okay.
The 12th.
Okay, so it's tentatively scheduled for the 12th. I'm not sure if the tentative is a reference to Zoom or possibly some updates on the transition, but certainly Danny will keep everyone up to date. I want to thank Deputy Commissioner Nash for joining us this evening. Thank Lieutenant Richardson for joining us this evening. With that, do I have a motion to adjourn the meeting? Thank you. Mujib, do we have a second? We have a second from Ben Geffen. All right, well, thank you all. I hope that as we all anxiously wait for the transition to CPOC, that we keep with us the lessons of that this meeting, I believe this meeting in this format works out well. I mean, I think there's a value always to going out into the communities, but certainly we have increased our attendance at the meetings. I think we are on to something. So let us continue with all of that. I want to wish you all I was going to say get home safely, but you may already be home. So, take care, stay safe. Sylvia, it's always a delight to see you, and we'll see you in July. Bye.
Have a good night, everybody.
Thanks.